Welcome to our next candidate question and answer session. I'm Brian Ewert. I'm running for Congress here in the 7th Congressional District in Wisconsin. This is now our 5th question and answer period. We found these extremely helpful in terms of being able to communicate with the voters and the members of the community here in the 7th Congressional District. For those of you who are joining us live on Facebook, please click the share, and that way others of your friends will know that we're live for the next 20 minutes. And then we'll also be posting this video later on our webpage so people can watch it later on. Well, it's been about 2 weeks since we did our last question and answer period, and it's been a busy 2 weeks. About a week ago, we were in New Richmond, which is in St. Croix County, and we were being hosted by the St. Croix County Democratic Party. It was clearly a very energized meeting, partly because of their incredible success with the special Senate election that they had for the Wisconsin legislature. Patty Shockner won that election. This was an area of the state that had strongly gone for President Trump, and Patty Shockner was able to completely flip that, gaining herself national news coverage as yet another area of the country looking for candidates who will support community, speak to the needs of the people in the communities, speak to the needs of the voters, and win elections, which to me sounds like exactly the winning formula we need. So the next stop on our campaign trail was in Chautauqua on Saturday around noon. We had a great meeting in one of the local restaurants with over 20 people coming, including one of the local retired physicians, and he certainly had the great questions to ask about healthcare and his concerns. He devoted his life to serving people in that community for over 50 years, and so had a great perspective on the healthcare needs. Our next stop was in Milltown, which is in mostly western Wisconsin, and that was the Polk County Democratic Banquet on Saturday night. An excellent night. There were many candidates there who we each had a few minutes to speak to the audience so that the audience got a way to get a good taste of many of the candidates both running for the Congress as well as other offices. And of course, one of the best parts of the evening is the chance to talk to voters and the concerned and engaged Democrats who are in Polk County. And then we finished up in Cumberland, another event where we had over 30 people in the room. Great time of question and answer with them, hearing their concerns and speaking to their issues. So, as always, it's absolutely wonderful to get out and actually meet with the people in the district, hear what their concerns are, and also hear what their joys are. So, it's been a great couple weeks on the campaign trail, and we are certainly looking forward to having questions today. So I think we're ready for the first question.
This is a huge district. How do you plan on interacting with various areas and groups of people?
Well, this is certainly a very large district, just short of 20,000 square miles. About 1/3 of the counties in the state are in the 7th Congressional District. So it does create some challenges in terms of how do we communicate and get various meetings. And obviously, given the format we're using today, this type of live question and answer is one of the ways in which we do reach out to hear your concerns. The other is that we certainly make every attempt to get out into the district, particularly for the county meetings. And during the intro, I actually forgot one of them, which was our second visit to Tomahawk for the Lincoln County Democratic meeting. Again, another great venue to meet with the voters. And so getting out to the Democratic meetings, we've also been scheduling candidate events throughout the district. Currently, we are working on heading into the northern counties here within the next few weeks, and then also working on getting back to the eastern counties. So a lot of it just comes down to the great organization that the campaign staff is doing to get us up into the district, as well as doing question and answer and using social media so that we can hear your concerns and you can respond.
What ways can we simplify healthcare?
That is a very important question, because what we know about United States healthcare is we pay twice as much as other similar countries, and yet we get less quality. So clearly part of the problem with the cost of healthcare in the United States is the complexity of healthcare. So there is that large economic issue that we have a very inefficient system. But equally important is, what does that mean for patients? Because when someone is sick, when a woman hears that the mammogram has something abnormal on it, or someone says, oh, we found something on the colonoscopy, or someone hits the emergency room having chest pain, in any of those situations, the last thing that patient needs to be thinking about is, wow, how is this going to be paid for? Am I covered here? Is this hospital in my network? All of that complexity just adds unnecessary and undue suffering to the people who at that point, all their focus should be on what needs to be done to restore their health. So we clearly need to decrease the complexity of the healthcare system. Interestingly enough, there was just a recent large analysis on what are the 4 major reasons that United States healthcare costs so much. And it turns out one of those 4 were the administrative costs. Certainly in my own practice, in order to give patients the medicines that everyone knows they need, we have to contact the insurance companies and get approval. And sometimes it means the patient is sitting there in the office ready to be treated, but we have to postpone treatment while we wait for the insurance company to give us the go-ahead so that we know that it's covered. So clearly we need to decrease the background burden of taking care of patients. Typically in the United States, we have anywhere from 5 to 10 times the number of employees in a healthcare field just pushing the paper or clicking the keys to get the administrative work done. So that is going to be one of the ways that I think certainly in Congress we can look at how can we decrease costs, make the system more efficient, and actually improve healthcare for all Americans.
What is your opinion about net neutrality?
You know, I'm surprised we even have this discussion about net neutrality. Of course the internet should be neutral. It was built with taxpayer funds. The internet belongs to all Americans. That's how it was first developed. It was actually through the Department of Defense. And it has become now a major source of commerce, for education, for communication. It belongs to all Americans. It does not belong to a few select few corporations or incredibly wealthy people. It's there for all of us. And so definitely the internet needs to remain neutral. It is a key part of living in the 21st century.
Why did you want to be a doctor?
You know, thinking back to my childhood, I sort of progressed through some other professions along the way, but I think by grade school I'd started thinking of this, and partly was my family culture. I do come from a family of medical providers, and so growing up in church, I would go and hear about people who would be doing service, and it turned out I had an uncle who was a physician, and he had returned to India, which is where my grandparents had been missionaries. And so this model was put before me that it combined really 2 parts of our family culture. One was work as hard as you can to maximize the gifts you've been given. And so for me, that was working towards medical school. But the other was, how do you use your gifts to serve people? And so being a physician struck me as a great combination of the gifts I'd been given, the opportunities that had been presented, along with those core values I was being taught. Certainly in my immediate family, my mother was an obstetrical nurse. She became a midwife and actually did her midwifery training in Harlem. So she grew up in India, came to the United States for college and nursing training in central Kansas. But when it was time to learn how to be a midwife, she actually went to the tenements in Harlem to learn how to deliver babies. And then my father started off as a hospital chaplain. He had gone to seminary, and then he got a chaplaincy job. That being the late 1950s, it was a pretty natural extension for him to go from being the hospital chaplain to being the administrator of this community hospital in central Kansas. So I was really surrounded by people who encouraged me and, more importantly, provided great role models for how to utilize my talents and gifts, honor the resources that had been given to me, and also to honor the values that I'd been taught.
What is the importance of faith in your life?
Well, I grew up in the Christian tradition, and certainly it was a huge part. I mean, I was one of the young people in high school where youth group was actually my focal point of my community activity. So that would be both for youth group activities. Our youth church had a singing group made up of the high school students, so I performed with that group, and we would travel around the region doing concerts at churches. But also, more importantly, we would do service projects. And so growing up Mennonite, it turned out it was part of Mennonite disaster service. And that's one of those aspects of my history that I continue to deeply value. So growing up in Kansas, when there was a flood in the foothills of the Rockies, for the high school youth group, we'd get on a bus and we would go out to the Rockies to clean up after the flood. In college, there had been tornadoes in North Texas, and so over Memorial Day weekend, that was our vacation, is we drove down to North Texas and helped clean up after tornadoes. You know, what was very important in my upbringing, and particularly how it applies to my values and my public values, is the question of who is my neighbor. And obviously the person who is my neighbor is the person who is suffering. And I'm sure that played also a key part in becoming a physician. And also it turns out, how do you honor your religious commitments? You take care of the, quote, the least of these, those who are hungry, those who need housing, those who need attention. So clearly what faith for me has led to a lifestyle to focus on how do we provide service, and particularly how do we pay attention to those in society who need some assistance to come up. But of course there's also that time of celebration where we celebrate the successes as well.
What do you propose to address the plight of undocumented immigrants, and especially young people with DACA status?
Immigration is one of these key areas that speaks to several different issues in the country. And I think first it speaks to the dysfunction of Congress as it currently exists. Because there was a time where people in Congress realized that they may be Republicans and they may be Democrats, but at the end we live in communities, not political parties. And so you would come together and you'd say, you know, there's things that we're not going to give up of our Republican or Democratic values, but there's a large middle section there that we're going to work together. Immigration is one of those large middle sections. And in fact, in 2013, the Senate passed with over 60 votes a bipartisan immigration bill. It wasn't perfect from a Democratic perspective, and it certainly wasn't perfect from a Republican perspective, but it brought together ideas where people said, let's at least agree on this. Unfortunately, that bill was never taken up in the House of Representatives, and that was clearly a failure of leadership to not even take up the bill. If they would have felt a need to modify it, they could have modified it. They then could have gone to conference committee and eventually brought that bill into law, because that bill did provide pathways to deal with the fact that we have 11 million people in this country who are not here on legal status. So those 11 million people, what are they doing? Well, they are part of our communities. In Wisconsin, they add $8 billion of revenue to the state's economy. If all of the people who weren't here on legal status were removed from Wisconsin, the economic impact would be $8 billion. And of course, we also have the issue that the reason they're here is because the jobs they are doing were not being filled by anyone else. And so not only do we have those large economic issues, but clearly in Wisconsin, we're going to have a lot of very unhappy and soon-to-be sick cows because the agricultural industry and other parts of our Wisconsin economy require these workers. So we have an economic need to address this problem of immigration. We also have a community strength issue. The problem is when we have people who are living below the legal level in society, they are scared to call the police. What happens with that is that if there is a crime being committed, they're hesitant to call. That leads to weakening of our community. So we need to address that. And then specifically, the question came in about addressing the dreamers, or the deferred action folks. Clearly, what we need to be doing is finding a way for legal status for these people. These people, and as the law's already been written, came here as very young children. They've been here for a long time. They have no criminal record. Many of them have actually served in the military. they have become professionals, and they may be in graduate school becoming very engaged and participatory members of our communities. We need to find a way to honor that they have proven themselves to be worthy of having legal status.
In conversations with people during your recent travels around the district, what are some of the concerns and what are some of the sources of pride you've heard expressed?
Well, I think one of the first sources of pride is the level of engagement. This is absolutely amazing how people are turning out. I mean, at New Richmond, we had several candidates there, and that room was electric. Partly is Patty Shockner is there, and of course she's just an amazing candidate, now senator here in Wisconsin, and just a grounded in the community person. One of her stories absolutely amazed me. When her special election came up, she's the coroner, so she holds this obligation to the community to go out to very difficult situations as the coroner in that area. The night before the election, she got called out to a scene. She had to go and do her job as a coroner and investigate. She went home, freshened up, and went out and got out the vote, and of course won the election. It's only fitting that she did. It's just one example. So that kind of energy in the room has certainly been a great source of pride. I think we also sense of how much people do appreciate life here in northern Wisconsin. Whether people are living in small towns or they're living out of town in the woods, there's this richness that people clearly enjoy and want to be continued and strengthened. I think in terms of concerns is this notion that we're getting left behind. You know, clearly there are examples of this where when public policy is made, somehow the heartland and the rural areas tend to be forgotten and left behind. Excellent example is broadband. Broadband is not a luxury. It's necessary for childhood education. It's necessary for people to set up businesses. It's necessary for continuing education as adults need to retrain. It's necessary for health care as we move towards health care in the home. For all those reasons, we need to not be left behind here in northern Wisconsin, but we need to be in with the suburban and urban areas of the country. I think this is actually an excellent area where the bipartisanship can come in Congress, because the rural America is, in fact, mostly Republican right now. I think it's an excellent place as a Democrat for me to reach across the aisle and say, your constituents in Nebraska and Kansas and South Dakota also need broadband. My constituents in Wisconsin need broadband. Let's work together.
What can we do to help with your campaign?
Well, we are in petition signing season. So, appropriately, the state of Wisconsin requires anyone who wants to be on the ballot to do a little bit of work to prove that they're serious about this, and also to prove that there's broad support for their candidacy. So we've certainly done all of our federal paperwork filing to make sure that everything is done there, but now our next step is to get about 1,500 signatures on our petitions. So anyone who is legally able to vote in the 7th Congressional District can sign our petition. And fortunately, we've had many friends and supporters out gathering petitions, so we're well on our way to the 1,500. We started a week ago Sunday, and we end in about mid-May. We have to turn in the papers by the end of May, so we want to have some margin to check our signatures. So anyone who would like to sign a petition, message us through Facebook, contact us through the web page, however you want to get a hold of us, and we can even mail you a petition to sign. And anyone who would like to gather signatures for us, just let us know. We'll send you a packet. And it can even just be gathering the people in your household or your neighborhood or your workplace. All of those are tremendously helpful in furthering our campaign.
What can be done to increase the amount of frequency of community service in our communities?
I think this is where we as individuals can reach out. There are ample opportunities to volunteer. Certainly in my life, for housing, there was Habitat for Humanity, which for those of us who like carpentry, gives us the opportunity to get out and do what we'd love to do anyway. Almost every region of the 7th Congressional District has a food pantry, and food pantries always need volunteers for staffing purposes. as well as for collections. We'll be coming up here in the spring for where the Scouts do their collection and the post office does their collection of food items. So helping with sorting, so contacting your local food pantry. Other is domestic violence. Unfortunately, we do have domestic violence, but fortunately, we have agencies throughout the 7th Congressional District who work with families who have been impacted by violence so that children and those who are victims of the violence have a safe place to go. So I think part of it is just getting involved in your community and finding areas where there is need and where volunteers can help make our community stronger.
What can be done to get dark/big money out of politics?
Well, certainly getting dark money out of politics is fairly near and dear to my heart, because last summer, as we were thinking here, what can we do to change the tone of where politics is going, a good friend of ours, Ben, found out about United to Amend, which is the process where small towns and villages and governmental agencies and states are all passing resolutions encouraging the signing of for Congress to pass an amendment in order to overturn Citizens United. That's sort of shorthand for basically reversing over a century of Supreme Court decisions which have resulted in corporations being considered people and money being considered free speech, which then gives corporate money the same equal access to influencing political campaigns as individuals. And the problem with this is we now have this substantial explosion of unregulated and often unknown sourced money that's trying to influence campaigns. Certainly here in Wisconsin, we are ground zero for this. It's being written about nationally how for the Senate race, there are multiple ads which are attacking the Democratic candidate. It turns out it's not clear who's behind those ads. They don't have to disclose that this money is coming from outside of Wisconsin. We don't know what the interests of those people are, but we suspect that they really don't care about Wisconsin. What they care about is their own interests, which lie outside of Wisconsin. So clearly, I'm committed in Congress to sponsoring the constitutional amendment, which would clearly state that corporations are not people and money is not free speech, and anyone who wants to have impact on the political process we need to protect the right of one person, one vote, and anybody who's offering their input needs to be very transparent so we all know what their interests are, and then we can decide if we share those interests.
When your children are your age, what would you like their world to look like?
Well, I hope we continue on the trend that we started really in the 1970s of protecting the environment. You know, I certainly have benefited greatly by being able to go into the wilderness, whether it's up north Wisconsin or out to hike in the mountains, and I would want us to preserve this. So certainly now is the time that we need to address climate change, because we are at the point where we can still bend the curve in terms of the global climate change, but that window is going to close, and so we need to pay attention to that. I would also hope that they're in a world where everyone can get the education they need to get a job which puts them into the middle class, and in getting that education, they are not taking on such undue debt that they are not able to successfully launch themselves into adulthood. So, at this point, we do have time for one more question.
What is the importance of community in your work?
Well, in my work, I take care of people with kidney disease. And kidney disease is a very complicated disease. In fact, when we take care of patients, it's not just one person taking care of the patient. We have a team approach. So at the first level of just caring for patients, we have the patient care technicians who actually are interacting most directly with the patients and very skillfully taking care of their dialysis. We then have the nurses who make sure the medications are given and also troubleshoot when problems come up. Each patient has a social worker because these patients do have significant problems. We have a dietitian because it turns out when you have kidney disease, you need to eat differently to stay healthy. And then I'm part of it too, but clearly that's just the core team. So we actually have a community that takes care of the patients even in the dialysis center. Same sort of situation when we take care of patients before they're on dialysis. We have the medical assistants, the nurses, the physicians, and we also importantly have all the people who keep the business side of medicine going so that when I need to see a patient, I have the resources I need. In the hospital, again, the nurses and the vast number of people who help us care for patients. But beyond that, I'm always impressed with how my patients are supported by the community around them. I certainly have stories where when we have blizzards like we had 10 days ago, there are times where the dialysis staff actually helps and go and get patients out of their homes when they're going to be snowbound, and we often have neighbors who know to be sure and plow the driveway of the person next door because they need to go to dialysis tomorrow. I've also had stories where when the caregiver all of a sudden becomes hospitalized and the dialysis patient is home, the next thing we hear is how the neighbors are taking in meals. So clearly, coming together as a community is how the patients I also have the privilege to care for, how they get their care. I do play my role, but clearly their care would not exist without the full support of all of the community. So I'd like to thank you again for joining us for this question and answer period. Certainly if you have more questions, you can send them in to the Facebook page. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can send them to push the questions in on our webpage, which is ewertforcongress.com. We'd be happy to answer your questions and interact with you that way, or save them up for the next live question and answer. Thanks for joining us.